The role of the architect, I think, is to bridge that top-down, bottom-up gap, right? Architects are really good, multidisciplinary. They know a little bit about a lot of things, not too much about anything in depth. We also are trained to really manage and be directors in between those disciplines. We're naturally kind of producers because no one really produces a project single-handedly, right? It's not Carlos Scarpa drawing to the middle of the night. So I think all of that training makes the architect super good to become a kind of producer of the city. And he's also trained, should be trained to visualize that city in some way. So he can do quick, unsolicited visualizations of what cities could be like or what buildings could be like, or etc. So I think the role of the architect is really to provoke and activate new thinking on the way we should live and connect the gap between the professions.
I think architects are cultural producers. So like our interest and also our presentation was to show that there is for the United States, I think the bottom up is not a grassroots movement kind of thing. For us, the bottom up is the cultural psyche, the mythologies that are produced that create aspirations and desires in the American people, right? So I think that the most influential cultural producers are filmmakers, I think, in the history of the last couple of decades. And I think architects participate in cultural production and have maybe shied away more recently from understanding that role as also participating in creating desire, but not in a consumerist, like capitalist way, but creating like an understanding of what we should desire. We should want to be able to have a great meeting on a fast train between New York and Boston, like, and I know what exists in America that prevents that from happening. But if there is that aspiration, the same aspiration that created the open road and the notion of suburbia, I think, because architects participated in suburbia, but not as necessarily active participants. They were just responding to developers asking them to design little, catalog homes, etc. But I think we can not just be responsive, but we can actually be proactive. That's why this project is interesting, or the MoMA projects that they've now done 2 years in a row, the foreclosure exhibition and the rising currents, because they're asking, okay, we're not a client and you don't really get to build this project per se, and it's not this scale, but we want you to think about these bigger issues and disseminate it to a larger audience.
I think that they have to be responsible in a certain ways in the social dimension. So in the past decades, actually, Chinese architect has been, we call that how to say, as the helper of government and developers to make the country move so fast. The architects are always the people to back up that directions very in the stream, right? But in a certain dimension is because I'm talking about unbalanced development, because that dimension is so one-dimensional, and then they only push the GDP into the very high end, right? But they, at the same time, they're losing the other dimension, the social aspect, the ecological aspect. So the architects, I think, is at the moment you need to back off a little bit, overlooking all these kind of all the aspects would helping the society moving on the more balanced or healthy way. So what I mean is, so that's why I said the architect can play a role, at least to persuade the bureaucrats and also the developers and certain kind of to concern about the other dimensions. So I think architects as independent agent. In a way, you should be aware that kind of a social responsibilities. So that's why nowadays we talk about this. Okay, but we haven't really come to a consensus. Everybody would add together to have make a collective effort. But we are starting to talk about this, and this is a really but this is a very good question. So what kind of role architect can play at this moment? Not only making a lot of money, out of the design from the developers and the government, but also you need to be design the public that kind of awareness and should be embedded on the process of a design. So I'm pretty much encouraged that directions.
Look, I mean, see, this is the thing, right? Like, when architects work, they're always working otherwise from this top-down perspective, right? There's always this architectural profession is very patron dependent, right? You always wait for that one patron to come to you, and that patron then always has those clean boundaries to offer you, right? And this is something that a lot of our, in fact, if I go back a little bit, CRIT is not an office, it's also a collective. Okay, it's a collective that also has in those ways kind of amorphous boundaries. We come together as groups of people, we sort of don't wait for a patron to come to us. We work with the city, we work with engagements in the city, and then start looking at, how is it possible to then have these kind of tactical engagements. So in some ways, we are always repositioning ourselves. Look, the government is doing its job, right? Like the government is making these infrastructure projects, and they probably also need to work through this idea of equity and planning and sort of providing things for everyone in some ways. But then there is a slippage, right? There's a slippage in that logic of the city. And so where do these architects operate? Architects operate in these tactical ways that in some ways are constantly transforming this kind of top-down logic. So a lot of times what we do is we actually work with communities, right? And so if you remember that kind of web of stakeholders, in some ways we say that, if these guys are moving from here to here, yeah, now we sort of start looking at how we could actually work with those communities to somehow reinsert yourself back into that web. Yeah, so you somehow try and change the power equation a little bit somewhere. Yeah, so it's not, and this is interesting because it's this kind of web where it is possible then to have these tactical interventions. It's not a black and white, it's not this kind of idea of, someone who's powerful and everyone else who's exploited. It's a web and, everyone has that little bit of power to sort of tweak a little bit. So if I just give you a small example, in Bombay we have this, in Mumbai we have this, the slum rehabilitation policy, right? So somewhere in the 90s, the government changed its role from becoming a provider to a facilitator, and so they got these developers. I showed a bit of that, and so what happens is that a slum dweller should be given housing free of cost, yeah, and in return the developer gets building right to sell in the open market. Okay. Now one way to look at it is that this has gone, a lot of gentrification has happened because real estate developers are only interested in that land that slum dwellers are living on, and so that's, that's a very simple idea. That often social sciences will say, okay, there's all this gentrification that's happening, but if you look a little more closely into what's really going on, people are also understanding, people are not naive and, silly, and they're also understanding that they can play up markets, right? So they realize that they have bargaining capacities, that they can actually also somehow become developers, and that's something that we help them do. We said, okay, can you also become, it's not easy, but, can you play the role of the developer? Yeah, is it possible to get that land and build your own housing typologies, which probably have slightly some more transactional capacities than the housing that the developer is providing. So that's the idea is that power structures can be tweaked, and I think one needs to then work with these kind of tactical engagements.
I think architects have a role to orchestrate because of course a building takes a lot of parts to put together, so we have that kind of talent, or not talent, let's say, training. And the other training we have is to be able to envision the future, because any building you build, of course, architecture is expensive and you have to convince quite a few bodies to make it happen. So there needs to, I mean, there is this inherent job description that we envision lives inside buildings, and we then kind of convince people that this life, the future we're envisioning for them is the correct future for them, or we kind of have a discussion with them, we kind of arrive at that point of agreement for the future, and then the construction begins. So I think those two roles can jump in scale back and forth. So you could design a house, or you could think about the city. Of course, the city is much more complex, and of course there is a lot more experts you need to talk to. But and you can probably you cannot design a city, but at the same time you can design an image or a future
fragments
within it. Yeah, so that's how we see the role. And I guess there is, for us, it's also we like the tradition of the architect as kind of also with a social agenda or with a public agenda. We like this role, and that's why our practice is not necessarily commercial work, and we do a lot of research projects, a lot of self-initiated work.
Probably the situation must be same not only to Japan but also for other countries, including China or some other countries whose representative architects have made a presentation today. But the duty or the responsibility of an architect in the world have to have a perspective which go beyond just the scope of human beings, and we are really entering into that phase.